All right, I'm Anne Marie, and I'm going to be talking about the second thing that we did to try and address the problem of horrible topics that Chad mentioned at the beginning. So he started talking about the impetus for the changes we made in Writing 121, and then Hannah picked up with the first thing we did, which was really try and recalibrate students' thinking about this process away from finding a controversy or a debate they could win, and towards finding a topic that they were simply curious about, that they wanted to explore for a few weeks, so that their primary goal was going to be expressing that curiosity and learning in their paper. They took the self-assessment, which an instructor could use in a class deliberately to talk about topic selection. You're interested in interpersonal curiosity. Maybe you should look and see what kinds of things that psychology researchers are doing, something like that. But mostly, we really just wanted students to start thinking more broadly about curiosity, more broadly about the types of things people are curious about and that they might be able to research, and also to help them thinking more about curiosity as their primary goal in this exploratory research process. The second thing that we did was we structured that topic selection process by starting them off exploring. I mean, basically you can say that in summary, what we're really doing here is trying to encourage them to browse before they chose a topic so that they might encounter something that they didn't know about before, that they were curious, that would spark their curiosity in one of those ways. And so we structured that in Writing 121 in three main ways. And I'm going to start by showing you what those were, but then I'm going to also show you some additional things that you can do to structure curiosity and to encourage curiosity and exploration in topic selection. So we're thinking this slide is probably making you kind of curious. What does the pruny fingers mean? This was really the impetus, really got us thinking about the lack of curiosity as a deficit in student papers, and that topic selection being a place where that was happening. One of the instructors of Writing 121, unfortunately for him, not Chad in this particular case, had a student who wrote a paper about why your fingers get pruny when they're wet. And when we were talking about that paper as a really great example of an excellent exploratory research process paper, that spark of curiosity was obvious. It was just one of those Friday Weird Science posts on Facebook, and he saw it and thought, this is something I want to explore, and there happened to be a controversy attached to it, so he was able to do that. And that really got us thinking about just coming up with something that you're curious about right now, that you just encounter in your daily browsing of the world. That can be something that sparks your curiosity and gives you something to write your research paper about. So how we decided to come up with ways that we could replicate that experience for students who maybe didn't get lucky enough to see this image of pruny fingers on their Facebook. This was probably the most popular resource that students used for this. This first piece here is about different places that aggregate press releases about research and discovery. Now, we are a research institution, and one of the functions of Writing 121 is to start teaching academic writing and introducing students to academic sources. So one reason that we focused on research and discovery as something that might spark students' curiosity was because, like many students across the country, they're required to use peer-reviewed journal articles. And so by starting their browsing process in a place that's about research and discovery, it made those logical sources for them to progress to. It made those logical sources for them to use in their exploratory process. This is Science Daily, and Science Daily just aggregates all of those press releases that universities and research labs put out every day about the research happening in those institutions. They're written for a general public audience. They tell the significance of the research. They include links to the scholarly articles where the research is reported, and it's a really browsable site. If you look at that gray bar across the top here, you'll see you can browse it by a variety of different topics, including Quirky, which is actually a fairly new addition to this site. So it's browsable, they can find something they're interested in and bring it to class. Chad, when he did it, actually had the students browse this site. Was it write a discussion board post or write a free write?
It was more of like a discussion board post where I kind of tricked them into the exploration process where they browsed this site and then like picked one that they were just interested in and could communicate to somebody else an interest, and then they shared it, and then it was like, surprise, this is your research topic. So.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say, is that he tricked them and
Yes.
didn't even tell them they were searching for a topic. But what he says is that very few of them decided to switch after finding out that this was going to be their topic. Other TAs told them from the beginning that you'd be looking for a topic that you were willing to spend the next 3 or so weeks on. We will include some other links to aggregators like this on the blog post that accompanies this presentation. A lot of these same institutions will also push those press releases out using Twitter. So this is an example of Harvard pushing out new discoveries at Harvard on Twitter. And if you're on a campus or in a place where a lot of your students or users use Twitter, they could simply find a few of these to follow and encounter that research in that way. We did it a little bit differently. We pulled these different Twitter accounts together for them in a list using our library account. So we have a list called Research Discoveries, or Research Announcements, I think it's called. And then we use Twitter's widget function to create an embeddable list of those discoveries, which we could then put in the guide that we give Writing 121 students to accompany Unit 2. So this is pretty much the same information that they would get on Science Daily, it's just in a different format. And the jellyfish bloom is a popular topic that has appeared more than once. There's a couple things I want to mention about this before I move on. One is that even though these are seem very science focused, I mean, Science Daily is the name of the first one, and there's a sciencey picture here of jellyfish. Most students are able to find something that interests them in this, even if they have no interest in what would typically be considered the life sciences or the hard sciences. Science can be a little scary, and we worried about that, turning people off at the beginning. It really hasn't been a problem. If you want to study movement, if you want to study music, if you want to study art, there are studies in these resources that get at those topics as well. And I do not remember the second thing I was going to say, but I'm sure it will come to me. This is my favorite. I don't know how widely used it is. We actually created this for a different workshop, one that we used with our first year seminars. But what it does is that it highlights the research being done here at OSU. So if students want to browse instead of all research being done anywhere, they can browse new research and discoveries happening here at OSU. We simply created a Google Maps using our university's RSS feed of new research announcements, and we put a pin on the PI's office on campus for each of these studies. So when they click on the pin, they get the faculty member's name, who's the PI on the study, and then they get a press release. They might get a link to some news information, and they get a link to that faculty member's page. And so it's just, again, another way of kind of accessing or packaging the same information. And I knew I would remember what I was going to say before, but you know what? It belongs better here anyway. One of the things that's great about all three of these sources is that it starts students building a context for their topic from the very beginning when they're choosing that topic. So if they're in Science Daily, they can start seeing the context because they'll see the connection back to the scholarly article, and the article being written for a general audience will explain the significance of the study to them in a way that they wouldn't get if they went straight to that scholarly article. This gives a different type of context. A lot of students in first year composition are only beginning to really understand the disciplines, how they're different, that there are disciplines, that they are different. And one of the mental models they have for understanding where these disciplines are is simply where they're located on campus. So it's a physical metaphor for them to use, that they can browse virtually and start to place these studies and the research that's happening in our different colleges and departments from the very beginning of that exploratory process. Okay, so those were the three things we did in Writing 121, but we also want to point out a few other ways that you can use what's available on the web to create this structured browsing experience for students when they're choosing for topics. This is Newsmap, and it's aggregating news information from Google News. So it's really a skin on the top of Google News that's reformatting that information in the form of a tree map, which is a really popular visualization form for data that is primarily textual. So it works really well for news information. I use this a lot in Writing 222, which is our advanced composition class. and it focuses on public writing. What I like about this is that it immediately starts giving students context for the news information in a few ways as well. One is really simple. You can see some of the stories here are bigger than others. That means that there are more links in and out of those stories, that the conversation around those stories is more active. If they click on a story or mouse over it, they're going to get a link to additional articles, which is another way of building context. But the best ways that they can use this to build context are in the bars across the bottom and the top of this page. So across the bottom of this page, they can drill into these stories by subject. So blue, for example, is sports. So if they were to click the blue spot on the bottom bar, it would bring up only stories about sports. And this is what I do when I demonstrate this tool in classes. It'll default to a United States emphasis. And across the top, the little tabs allow you to change that to other countries. So it would be activity around Google News stories at computers with IP addresses in a particular part of the world. So when I demo this, like I said, I drill into sports using the bottom bar, and then across the top, I go and look at what India is showing or what India is reading at that moment. It'll default, like I said, to the United States. So when I pull it up initially, there'll be a lot of stories about football, basketball, baseball, football, unless the Olympics are going on, and then it'll be football and Olympics. When I switch it over to India, though, there are always big stories about cricket, about tennis, and about soccer. So that is a really, really quick way for students to start to see that these news and policy conversations are culturally and geographically contextual. They're not universal, and they can start to build that context and that understanding for themselves right away. And then these are a few ways that you can build browsing environments for students using timelines or chronologies. So this one is Tiki-Taki, and I think on the next slide I have the interface that you would use to build these little modules. But on this slide I want to show that you can tag the little modules by different types of information if you're using this to create an information browsing environment. So this is the Mars Curiosity. That's our topic, curiosity, get it? And I have different types of resources here in my timeline. One of the things I love about this is that it really, really immediately visually demonstrates the length of time between the point when Curiosity started sending data back to NASA and when the first peer-reviewed data was published in journals. And it's a long, long, long way down that timeline. You can't show it in just one screen. And it's a really quick way for students to see the length of the scholarly research process. So this is the interface. It's a little bit clunky that you would use to create those modules. And you can create backgrounds. I personally don't love this background. I think it's a little busy, but some people do, so I included it. Not people in this room. Some people in the world do. This one is Timeline.js, and what I like about this is it allows you to create your timeline using a Google spreadsheet instead of by hand. So you have your data in its fields in their spreadsheet template, you put in your data, and then it generates this very attractive looking timeline document. So that's just a few different ways that you can use to structure the topic selection process. And Chad's now going to talk a little bit about how all of this played out in the first year composition classroom.
Okay. So to bring it back to the classes that I brought this into on the pilot program, and I don't think I mentioned, but I ran 3 sections of this sort of curiosity-based research pilot, 3 sections of classes, that is, on this. And I immediately noticed the change, and it actually highlighted how difficult it was for me to be grading and how difficult it was for students to be researching on the original way of doing the research on Unit 2. I noticed immediately that the papers that I got from my first section focused, instead of things like stem cell research and teaching of evolution in our classrooms, to things like security issues of robotic jellyfish patrolling our oceans and 3D printing of organs being used in hospitals and whether that was something to be invested in. So not only did it create for what I feel is much more interesting research, but students were able to actually diversify and think about their own major fields and the kinds of things that they would be doing later on in their education and lives, and apply that to 121, which is a huge goal that we have, of course, to show that writing and research is something that happens throughout the process of education and life. So it was a lot more applicable, I think, to students as well. Another thing that I had noticed too was brought up that I kind of tricked my students into selecting their topics is, and Anne-Marie had mentioned too, is that I don't recall a single time when a student decided to switch topics from when they were researching to when they were actually applying that later on in Unit 3, when they were choosing a form to be able to persuade an audience with that particular research that they did. So even students who were picking up on things that are really just cutting edge research and maybe couldn't find a whole lot of peer-reviewed articles, maybe just one or two, were still able, and maybe even more so, able to make arguments based on that, with a lot more of that sort of passion behind it as well. At least that's what I had to see. So yeah, just to comment on the two other things that are up here. These weren't my students, but colleagues have shared with me some of the other interesting topics that their students have written on. On the top right, you'll see someone had written about how it has been scientifically proven, apparently, that when you curse, when you hurt yourself, it triggers something in your brain so it doesn't hurt as much. So it's okay to curse when you hurt yourself because then it means that it's not hurting quite as much. And then there was also, to bring it back a little bit more, for students who still sought a little bit more about controversy, thinking about teaching of multiple languages and second languages within the United States in classrooms was another topic that a student had made a YouTube video about. So overall, I think that there are some really exciting things going on right now in 121 because of curiosity, and it's exciting to think about as it continues and what students will kind of put into it. Oh, and I should say selfishly as well, it's a lot more fun to grade these papers. So, but that's just selfish of me to say, so.